Hellblazer podcast.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. Today we're reading issue number 168, and just a little catch up on what's been going on. In the last couple issues, we had the storyline called Highwater, where John was in the town called Highwater in the Pacific Northwest, and he was dealing with some neo-Nazi skinhead groups, and the wife of his friend Lucky, who had fallen in with them. I guess in the time between Lucky dying and John finding her here, she had become racist, and the ghost of Lucky had actually told John to go here because he wanted John to save her. Now, John was here for that reason, but he was also here because Agent Frank Turo, who got him out of prison at the beginning of Azzarello's run, told John to come here because it had something to do with a man named S.W. Manor that he's been investigating for a while, who is also supposedly the guy that Lucky owed money with, and that's why he killed himself in front of John, all this stuff. So there's a couple different layers going on there. But basically, John went to Highwater, pretended to be okay with these neo-Nazis in order to get close to them. And by the end of it, they were all dead because either John manipulated them or he actually did some actual magic, which is the first time he's done it in this, I think, that's like officially magic, which was he raised a golem from the dead body of the gun dealer that the neo-Nazi skinhead bought weapons from. So at the end of that whole story arc, John found out that there was another secret he didn't know. Lucky decided that he felt guilty as a ghost, even though he's already dead and everything. And he told John a secret. We don't know what that secret was, but it made John not care about Lucky's wife, Marjorie, anymore. And he basically burned her house to the ground and said, fuck you. So I don't think we're going to be seeing much of her anymore. And that's where we left off. So first things first, with issue 168, we got the cover. We see John standing and smoking, and he's staring at us, but there seems to be a blinding light coming from us because he's squinting pretty hard. And behind him is what looks like a wall that is a giant bingo card. And on the cover, we can see that this is written by Brian Azzarello, and it looks like we're getting a couple fill-in artists for Marcella Fruchin because the artists on this issue are Giuseppe Camuncoli and Cameron Stewart. And as we turn to the first page, we see what looks to be a train station and bus depot, and a woman is getting out of a car. She's a young 20-something with longish red hair and a red shirt that says Kitty on it, and then she has a black leather skirt and knee-high black leather boots. And as she gets out of this guy's car, she spits on the ground, and that person drives away, and then she walks over to the nearest window where she can see her reflection, and she pulls out a black lipstick. And as she reapplies it, turns out the wall she was staring at was a door, and a hand opens the door. We can kind of see, it looks kind of like John's hand, but we can't really see it as she says, "Hey, sweetheart, you looking for a date?" And as we turn the page, we see it is in fact John that she's speaking to, and it seems like this woman with the kitty shirt is a sex worker, and she's propositioning John. And John doesn't answer her for a minute. He just looks at her, and then he pulls out a cigarette and he lights it. And as he takes his first drag, he answers, "No, but I do have an hour or so to murder." And weirdly, in this panel, he gets a big, evil grin, and his eyes turn red, so it seems like he's up to some mischief. So John takes his pack of cigarettes, and he opens it towards her, offering her one, and as she grabs for it, she says, "A whole hour? That's gonna cost you." And then instead of grabbing a cigarette, she actually just grabs his hand, and then pulls John towards her so she can reach the cigarette pack with her mouth. And as she does this, John asks, "Time well spent?" And she answers, "I promise." And then she leans in with her head, and she takes the cigarette that's sticking out the furthest into her lips very suggestively. And John says, "Coming from your precious little mouth, that's very promising." And then he pulls out his lighter and he lights it, and we get another panel where as he flicks the lighter on, his face is covered with shadow, and all we can see is his eye and his evil smile again. And as they both stand there puffing their cigarettes, John does a bow, and then he sweeps his arm to the right, and he says, "So, Shall we shove off, get some money, and get down to our dirty business? And with that, she takes his arm and they begin to walk down the street. And she points a little ways down and says, "Cool beans. There's an ATM just up the block." And John's confused and he asks, "A what?" And she answers, "ATM? A bank machine?" And as John looks around the street, he says, "Is there? Lovely. Pity I don't have a bank account." And at that, the woman gets a little bit of an angry look on her face, and she says, "What? How are you supposed to get any money then?" And as John casually walks, he says, "I have my ways." But she stops walking and pulls her arm away from his and says, "Good for you, but I ain't going there." And I believe she thinks John's talking about some criminal ways to get money. So John stops walking. He's only a couple paces in front of her now. And without looking at her, he says, Now, robbery ain't me game. No stick-up kid here." And then he looks back at her and says, "But a tenderloin such as you don't come cheap, and I'm a bit light. So what say we separate some folks from their dollars the old-fashioned way?" And then he turns back around waiting to hear her answer, and she just looks angry and says, "And how's that?" But as she says that, we see that John has a big smile on his face that she can't see because he's facing away from her. And we turn the page, and we are in some sort of church room where there are a bunch of old people playing some sort of game, and John is yelling out, "Bingo!" with a very happy and excited look on his face because he has just gotten bingo. So we've kind of jumped ahead in time to them having found this local bingo game at a church, and John has just won and is yelling out bingo. And we see on this page that the name of this issue is A Fresh Coat of Red Paint. And I should say the sex worker is still with him, and she is playing bingo next to him at the table. And she's pretty excited because she says, "Jesus Christ, 6 wins in a row?" And we see in front of John there's a stack of money, and John kind of gestures to it and asks, "That enough to get in your knickers?" And then she leans close to John and says, "Depends what you want to do when you get there." And then John smiles and says, "Right. Best play another card." Now, they're not at a table by themselves, and apparently the old people sitting across from them can hear every word. And keep in mind, this is like at a church, so these people are Christians, they're wearing crosses around their neck, but they're just, old people playing a fun game, and these two young people that are very horny keep winning, so I'm sure they're not too happy about that. So as John says, "Let's play another card," the sex worker gets very excited about that, and she hugs him and says, "Hell yeah, you're on a lucky streak." And John says, "Can't say I've been on many before." But as he says that, the sex worker looks over and notices the older people staring at them, and she gets a very sour look on her face and says, "What are you looking at?" And then the two older women across from them begin to whisper to each other, but not answer her. And John wags his finger at them and says, "I don't think these birds approve." But then the sex worker just reaches down to John's crotch, and as she rubs him, she says, "I don't care what they think, lover. Do you?" And then John looks down at his crotch where her hand is, and we hear the announcer yell, "B11." Then John gets a big smile on his face and he says, "Let me see. They think that we don't belong here, that we're invaders." And as he says that last line, he looks up at the old women judgingly, and then he grins, and the sex worker looks over at them and grins as well, and she says, "That's cool," because she doesn't care what they think, and she's going to continue stroking John through his pants. But as John still stares at the old ladies, he says, "On the contrary, they think we're like rats or roaches, vermin, come to infest their tidy little home." Then we hear the announcer yell, "I-21," and John continues, "They think that after leading long, miserably unfulfilling lives, they deserve better." Then he leans towards the old women on the table and he says, "They think this is all the fun they have, and we're ruining it. That this bloody game is the only thing they look forward to week in and week out." And the announcer yells, "N35." And John continues, "They think their children are selfish, but that they were obviously better parents than yours were." And then John leans back in his seat and he continues, "They think you're beautiful, and they hate you for it." And the announcer yells, "G53." And then John grins and continues, "That I'm one degenerate bastard, and they wish that was their hand instead of yours." And John says that because The sex worker has not moved her hand from his crotch, so presumably she's still rubbing it. Now, during John's little speech here, more people than just the two women he's explicitly talking to are listening in now, and some of them cover their mouths as John says something shocking, or they look angry at him. But John isn't really taking notice of them. He's just looking at this one specific lady right across from him, and he continues saying, "They think you and me, we're going to do some right nasty things to each other before the night's over, and that it's been too fucking long since they've experienced anything nasty." And at that, the woman directly across from John bites her lip and grabs her golden cross necklace, almost like she's praying she could have a man like John right now. And John continues, "They wish they was young again, so they could kiss, lick, suck, and be touched." And then the announcer yells, "Oh, 69," which of course is a very apropos number when talking about sex. And then John leans a little forward towards the woman, and he continues talking about sex towards her, saying, "Sweat, drip, ooze, melt around a body that sets you deliriously on fire, but is infinitely hotter than yours. They never got enough of that. But who does?" And then John sits back casually and looks over at the sex worker and says, "So, love, to answer your question, no, I bloody well don't give a toss what they think." And then he looks out at his bingo card and he smiles and he says, "Bingo." So it seems John won again, even though he was teasing those older women. Then we turn the page and we cut to a place called Vanderbilt Hotel. Also, I should say, I'm not sure what city they're in, but I'm thinking maybe it's LA just by the way everything looks. There hasn't been any landmarks or anything, but there has been some palm trees, so it's either Florida or Los Angeles. And since the guy that sold guns to the neo-Nazis was from Los Angeles, I'm going to assume it's there. Now, this place that they're walking up to, like I said, is called Vanderbilt Hotel, but it has hourly rates and it's only one story. Usually this kind of place isn't called a hotel, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's actually a place called the Vanderbilt Hotel. And as they approach the front door, John says, "Here we are." And the sex worker asks, "This your hotel?" I guess asking if he owns the whole building. And as John opens the door for her and ushers her in, he answers with a question, "Not mine, but you like?" And as she walks in, she says, "It'll work." And John says, "That's all I ask of anything, really." And we see John and her past the front desk, and it seems like John must already have keys. And he asks her, "So how long you been in your particular line of work?" And she answers, "Few years. Money's good." "Fuck, money's great." And as they wait for the elevator, John says, "Looking like you, I imagine it is." And she says, "You know, that's a common misconception." And John's kind of confused and he asks, "What?" And she answers, "The looks thing. Sure, I know I'm hot, but it's performance that counts. Trust me, I've seen girls, crack whores with rotten teeth, stinking like piss, suck off some Hollywood douchebag in 30 seconds. And as the elevator door opens, John looks at her and asks, "Is that good?" And as she walks into the elevator, she says, "You ever do coke?" And then John thinks for a second and says, "Right, that is good." Because if you don't know, and I don't know this from personal experience, but I have heard tell that if you do a lot of cocaine, it is hard to get it up. Then we see the elevator arrive at the 3rd floor, and the doors open, and as they get off, the sex worker's saying, "So my point is, looks will get you in, but it's how you do the job that gets you business." And as they turn and walk down the hallway, she looks at John and says, "And that's all this is, business." And as John flicks his cigarette onto the carpeted hallway, he says, "I thought you fancied me." And she answers, "I do. Too bad I didn't meet you on my night off." And as they get to the door that reads room 311, John asks, "When's that?" And she answers, "Honey, I don't ever take nights off. What's your name anyway?" And then John gives her a grin and says, "Ha, John. Funny that." And she smiles back and says, "If you say so, John. What do you want to call me?" And as John knocks on the door, he says, "Kitty'll do," because her shirt says Kitty on it. And she looks shocked as John knocks and asks, "This ain't your room?" And as someone on the inside opens the door, John answers, "No." And as John walks through the open door and into the room, John looks at the man who opened the door and says, "Hello, Turo." So this is Agent Frank Turo. And Frank greets John saying, Constantine. And then he goes to sit on top of the dresser where there is a bottle of Jack Daniels and some beer. And as he grabs the bottle, Kitty asks, "Who's this guy?" As John closes the door behind her, he says, "Come on, love. You knew when we walked into a place like this, it'd be crawling with bedbugs." And then Frank says, "We bite too." And then Kitty goes to sit on the bed, and then she stares at Frank and asks, "You a cop?" And Frank answers, "FBI." "You a whore?" And she answers, "Sex therapist." And then she scrunches her face like she smells something gross, and she asks, "What stinks in here?" And then Frank points towards the open bathroom door, and he answers, "A fresh-laid mean shit." And then he passes John the bottle of alcohol, and John takes it, and then John smiles and says, "You ain't that fresh or mean, Turo. What's with the mustache now?" And if you remember in the Hard Times arc when Frank Turo was introduced, I don't remember if I really called it out, but he had a thick mustache and goatee, and now he's just got a pencil-thin kind of John Waters mustache. And as Frank smiles at John and he rubs his mustache, he says, "Undercover. Dogfights. You like?" And then John jokes, "Mustache? Yes. Everything under it? No." And then Frank shrugs and says, "Hey, pal, I'm your buddy." And John takes a big drink and then says, "If only that were true. See, my buddies end up as bodies." And then he hands Frank back the bottle, and Frank asks, "And your enemies?" And then John gets an evil smile and says, "Worse." And then Turo mocks John by faking being scared and saying, "Oh." But John gets kind of angry and says, "Piss off." And Turo gets mad and says, "Fuck you." And while they're arguing, we see Kitty taking off her shirt, not really paying attention to this argument, and she asks, "Who's first?" And that stops the argument dead, and Frank looks at her very shocked and asks, "What?" And John in the background has an amused look on his face, and as Kitty takes off her bra, she answers, "Which one of you guys am I going to do first?" And Frank gets a kick out of this and says, "Ha, baby, if I fucked you, you wouldn't be in any shape for seconds." And as she throws her bra to the floor, we see Turo and John staring at her breasts very intently, and she says, "I like the sound of that." And Turo says, "Then you'd absolutely love how it feels." Then she gets on her hands and knees and crawls towards Turo, and as she kind of poses in front of him, she says, "Show me your cock. I bet it's big." But Frank restrains himself and he looks down at her and says, "Is that supposed to turn me on?" "Jesus Christ, you..." But he's cut off as John says, "I thought we'd do you together." And then he's kind of eyeing Turo as he says this, and Turo is now looking unsure. And then John asks, "It's all right, Kitty?" And she just smiles at him and says, "You got 600? Let's go." And then John begins to remove his jacket and he looks at Turo and says, "What do you say, Turo? My treat." And Turo is kind of not sure about this whole situation, and he defensively asks, "What are you, gay?" And John pauses with a kind of sour look on his face, but then he begins to unbutton his shirt and he says, I'm looking at this lovely girl here, and I'm getting a bit hot and bothered. Can barely wait to have at her. You, on the other hand, seem cool to the prospect. So was your question just that, or a proposition?" And then Kitty cuts in saying, "The asshole will cost you another 100. And then John says, "Hold on, love. You just said 6, him included." Which is John making a joke that is insinuating that Kitty meant that Frank is an asshole, not that she was talking about anal. So Frank says, "Ha ha, you're a regular Benny fucking Hill." And then John points at him and says, "Yeah? I ever tell you about the worst blowjob I ever got?" Which is John going into some kind of bit, because then Frank looks at him and smiles and says, "It was great, right?" And then John smiles back and says, "So you've met her." And the way they're looking at each other, it's almost like they're trying to one-up each other now. So as John finishes unbuttoning his shirt and starts to pull it off, Frank also loosens his tie and says, "Pick an end." So it seems he is now down with this devil's three-way between John, him, and Kitty. So as Frank undoes his tie and begins to unbutton his shirt, John asks, "How about we flip a coin?" And Frank says, "Heads, I win." And then Kitty leans over from the bed and begins to undo his belt and says, "You ain't gonna lose with tails either, honey." And as she starts to unzip his pants, Frank says, "You got some attitude, lady." And as John undoes his belt, he says, "That all you're noticing, Turo? You blind then, because, there's a topless woman undoing his pants. But Frank rudely jokes, nah, my eyes work. Nose too, insinuating that Kitty smells bad, possibly from some kind of venereal disease. And Kitty gets very angry at this and pushes him away and says, eat shit, I'm clean. But then Frank tries to double back and says, wasn't talking about you, sister. And then John says sarcastically, an interesting choice of words, Agent. I guess in reference to the word sister. And Frank gets very angry at that and says, go fuck yourself. And then John gets a big smile on his face and says, sorry, but I got it in me head to fuck someone else. And then Kitty goes over to John and she says, then let's get started, baby. But John looks at her and says, Kitty, I wasn't talking about you either. So it seems John is going to talk to Turo about some business before John has sex with Kitty. And I guess Turo is still intending to have sex with Kitty, but she's not paying attention to him now because he was being rude, she thought. So he asks John, someone specific in mind? And John answers, of course. And then he unzips his pants. And then Turo asks, anyone I know? And John answers, know of. And then John pulls out a cigarette and Turo asks, some of the guts that was spilled in high water belong to that Furman widow? And John seems to take a little bit of offense to that question. And John answers, not exactly. And then he drops his pants down so they're around his ankles, and he wasn't wearing underwear, so he was butt-ass naked, standing in front of Frank. So as Frank removes his shirt, he says, well, I could never get her to open up. You must be quite the charmer. And then John looks at Turo as he puffs his cigarette, and it's like he's figured something out, and he says, you knew all along. I'm assuming he's talking about the secret that Lucky told him, which caused him to be very angry at Lucky and Marjorie, so much so that he burned her house down in the last issue. And Frank looks guilty as he says, who was really behind you ending up in bars? Sure as shit I did. But what I didn't have was proof. And even if I did, and then John finishes Frank's sentence saying, you can't touch him. And then Frank gets angry for a second, and then he looks at John desperately and says, no, I can't. And then he looks over at Kitty, and it's kind of like he's second-guessing this whole situation, and then he closes his eyes and says, and I can't do this. So he starts to button his pants back up, and John kind of smiles and kicks off the pants around his ankles and says, all cock, no balls. And Frank says, yeah, that's what this is. And as he buttons up his shirt and John walks towards the bed naked, John says, is it? I got me a nose too, sunshine, and it's catching the odor of love. And then John sits on the bed next to Kitty and says, fidelity. And then Kitty starts to push John backwards and tries to straddle him, but John is still looking at Turo and he says, guilt. That odd piece of gray matter that puts the brakes on when the red matter is screaming bloody murder and threatening to live in a glorious, despicable moment. A nasty little switch installed by the Creator. What separates us from the animals, really. So, how'd you get one, Frank? And once again, John is taking a shot at Frank, insinuating that he is an animal. So Frank points at him and says, kiss my ass. And as Kitty begins to nibble on John's chest, she asks, he really is gay? And John answers, no, my dear Kitty. His love runs taboo. A bit more criminal than that. As John says this, Frank turns to go, and as he reaches for his coat in front of the door, he says, Constantine? And John looks back and says, what? And now we see Kitty's head in John's lap, so I'm assuming he's getting head while he's talking to Turo. And Turo answers, you're dead. And John asks, that a threat? And Frank says, no, it's a fact. Officially, you were killed in that riot back in prison. And John looks very intrigued by this as Kitty begins to kiss up his body again towards his neck. And as she caresses his face, John says, that's a real advantage I have. And Frank says, that's why I'm telling you. And then John gets a big evil smile on his face and he says, cheers. And then Turo opens the door to leave. And as he's about to walk out, John yells, Turo. And Turo turns back and John says, you done the right thing. And then he waves and says, kiss her for me. And if you remember earlier, John said something about fidelity, and that's what he was smelling on Turo. So it seems John has guessed that Frank Turo is married and could not go through with this whole three-way thing. So to John yelling, kiss her for me, Frank turns away from him and sneers and says, fuck you. And as John slaps Kitty on the ass and she starts to ride him, he says, that's the spirit. And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. And this is quite a weird one, I think mainly because there's story being told, but you are distracted as the reader by what's going on. This whole devil's three-way proposition, the nudity, and also like the back and forth kind of joking and teasing while they're giving information. It's a little bit hard to parse through. But there were some really good nuggets of information that are important. So John now knows that potentially the people that put him in prison think he's dead because of the prison riot records and Frank doctoring them. And we also learned that Frank was using John. I mean, we kind of already assumed that, but it was confirmed that Frank actually knew that John was innocent the whole time and used John in order to get to SW Manor, who he can't touch because he doesn't have the proof or evidence, but he was able to manipulate John and kind of sick him on SW Manor. So we'll have to see in the next issue if this information actually comes into play. But until next time, if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com, and we will see you on the next one.